Hello and welcome to another episode of the Tyndale House podcast. Today I am delighted to have three of our PhD students who are based here at Tyndale House for a discussion about Hebrew poetry. So we have Ellie Wiener, Megan Alsene-Parker and Ben Rae. And I'm delighted to have you as part of this conversation. So let's just go around. Tell us briefly a little bit about who you are, where you're from, what you're working on.
Sure. So I am the Job girl. Sometimes known as, my name is actually Ellie, but having some quality time with the Book of Job during my PhD. So entering my third year now and have been trending eastward generally from the States over the last couple of years.
My name is Megan and I am originally from Florida. I've been here in Cambridge now 2 years. And I am studying the Book of Lamentations and thinking about, how this book reflects on the destruction of Jerusalem and how it kind of forms the memory of the different people who would have read this text over and over again in the generations following.
And my name is Ben, I'm from Australia, and I'm particularly looking at Ecclesiastes and trying to understand how the book fits together, and particularly how does it work as a story that the author is telling about the teacher in Ecclesiastes.
Brilliant. So you're all working on nice, easy texts.
A very merry pair, trio, really.
Yeah, excellent. Let's start by, we're talking to all three of you because all three of your texts that you're working on contain Hebrew poetry. There's huge amounts in Job. Lamentations obviously is all poetry, isn't it? And there's some interesting bits in Ecclesiastes too. But let's start by broadening out to think about poetry in general. What is poetry in not Hebrew poetry, but what is poetry?
I think maybe it's helpful to think about language as a whole to start with, and recognizing that there's poetic elements to every language, and we instinctively use them when we speak. So things like alliteration, say something like below the belt sounds better than under the belt. And poetry is a sort of intensification of those kind of effects, whether it's alliteration or assonance or rhyme or various different things. So I think that's one aspect of it. I think another key aspect is that poetry is lineated. So as we hear it or as we read it, we arrange it mentally into lines that fit together. So each line fits and is a sort of unit in itself. But then we recognize that it interacts with the subsequent lines and the previous lines to create certain effects.
And you write poetry, don't you?
I write limericks.
Do you want to give us one of your limericks? I'm sure people will be delighted by that.
Yes.
Yes, all right. So
putting you on the spot.
I've written some about the different colleagues.
Oh, no.
So I'll give you one about Ellie.
This is excellent. This is exactly what we want.
There is a young scholar called Wiener whose memory couldn't be keener. She stored all of Job in her temporal lobe, though her social life has become leaner.
Brilliant.
It's doggerel, but it's fun.
I think that has the makings of going into the annals of the masterpieces of English poetry. But it demonstrates very nicely what you're saying about the lines connecting with each other. There's the choice of words, but also the way that the flow goes and the one leading into the next, the matching up of the lines, all those kinds of things give us that sense of it being poetry, whether it's doggerel or not, is not for me to say.
Yeah, and I think that the limerick probably also brings out another aspect of poetry, that when we get to the end of a poem, there's a click of completion to it. So that fifth line in a limerick it's got to rhyme with the first two lines to bring it together. And if it doesn't, it's a deliberate transgression of how it should feel. But that happens in other poems as well, whether they're sort of sonnets or in the sort of poems we'll be talking about today in the Bible.
Yeah.
I think it's worth mentioning as though when you refer to this note of completion, that is something that can be played with. So you have this readerly expectation that a poem is orderly and it comes to closure. But then sometimes authors do clever things to play on that expectation and to subvert it, which then has a different kind of effect. That could be within sort of poetry writ large or within Hebrew Bible poetry as well, which is just kind of a general observation that's made whenever people talk about genre, that you have this sort of body of shared characteristics, family resemblance almost, and then there are different ways of riffing off of that general set of norms.
I think I think the limerick is also a good example of how poetry works differently in different language families and different cultural expectations. That one of the things often we expect with English poetry is that it will have some manner of rhyme. And the limerick very, very clearly had that feature. But that's not necessarily a shared feature across all poetries and all languages. But that in English poetry, we have certain set expectations because of our corpus of poetry, because of these kind of different ways that have become normalized for English poetry specifically.
Sure. So to what extent are the kinds of things that you're saying, are those just as true of Hebrew poetry as they are of English poetry? I mean, you've commented on the rhyming already. We'll come back to that in a minute. But those general things about poetry, are they also true of Hebrew poetry?
Yes and no, I think. So in terms of it being an intensification of language, I think that is true. There are certain difficulties that we hit with Hebrew poetry because of our expectations that have been generated by other poetic cultures, as well as even simply how the poetic text is laid out in the Hebrew Bible. So for many poems in the Hebrew Bible, it's not broken up into obvious visual lines the way we're used to, and maybe even in our English Bibles, and certainly with poems that we might read elsewhere. So with Hebrew poetry, we're particularly dealing with an oral phenomena rather than a visual one. So we've got to ask ourselves, how do we hear the line, and how do we distinguish it from the next line, and so on and so forth.
And I think another complication is simply the fact that we're so temporally and linguistically removed from the poetry, right? So when I come to Hebrew poetry, I don't have as an innate sense of how this language works as I do with English. So in terms of being able to register what's clever, what's a deviation, those sorts of questions, I can certainly, sharpen my ability to perceive and to answer the more that I'm in Hebrew poetry. But just to recognize that, I have distance from this text in a way that does complicate. So I want to be a little bit careful whenever I say anything too prescriptive about this is how Hebrew poetry works and is, because I recognize I'm very much an explorer in kind of this unknown terrain, and I'm trying to gather observations and say sensible things as much as possible about how this works and what it's for.
And there's kind of two aspects, though. There is this distance, but there are things about poetry that do kind of tie people together across time and space, that there is experiential aspects of it and aesthetic aspects of it that very much just, I don't know, in some ways are just screaming for someone to read them and identify with them, that there's something there that you kind of are able to feel. I know that's very feely language for it, but I think emotionally it's meant to connect.
Absolutely, So you put me on to to Don Patterson,
yeah.
English poet, recently, and I was reading some of his stuff after that conversation that we had from his book, The Poem, and he talks about poetry being a meaning-infused aesthetic experience. And even with most people listening to this podcast are going to be reading in English rather than in Hebrew. But that the kind of things that you're saying, the fact that it's a meaning-infused aesthetic experience even comes through in translation, even though translation of poetry is so, well, I was going to say so difficult. Actually, it's impossible, isn't it? You can't properly translate poetry. Yeah. You can make a stab at it.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about this the other day because I remembered hearing something when I was younger, someone saying that Hebrew was a particularly appropriate language for God to put the Psalms in because its poetry doesn't rhyme and it has no metre, and so it's just easily translatable into any language. And I was thinking, is that just a sort of one of those pious things that people sometimes say? But I think there's actually more to it. There's more background to it, which is that Hebrew poetry has often been thought about as being constructed along parallelisms, so that you get a line that states a certain idea, and then the second line either repeats it in different language or contradicts it or something like that. So, which basically is saying the only poetic effects there are in terms of meaning.
Are conceptual packages that
Yeah.
you can very easily convey in another language.
Yeah, but actually when you start reading poetry in Hebrew, biblical poetry in Hebrew, you realise that actually that's not true. I mean, there are parallelisms between lines quite often, but it's not a controlling thing. So it's not like every line needs to parallel. That sometimes happens, just as there's sometimes matched rhythms between lines or rhyme between lines in Hebrew, but they don't follow all the way through like we tend to do in English.
Yeah, right.
And it's using all sorts of different poetic features like alliteration and assonance, rhyme, but it's switching them up as you go through.
So are you saying then that we can't, in some sense, define what we mean by Hebrew poetry because there aren't characteristic features? There's a whole collection of features, and we might see some or all even at play at different parts of the poem, but actually we can't draw a nice neat box round and say these are the criteria for which this piece of text needs to meet them in order to be classified as a poem.
I think I'm just generally skeptical of nice neat boxes.
I think we probably all are.
Few things fit into nice, neat boxes, and that's one of the difficulties of defining categories and especially genres and things like that. So there is kind of that aspect that I think the edges can be quite difficult to define. However, there is a corpus of poetic texts in the Hebrew Bible that, for the most part, everyone agrees on. And that center is, in many senses, kind of easy to perhaps characterize rather than define. That it shares features with itself, even though some of those features are flexible and not, tight constraints. And there's these kind of different ways that you can characterize what's going on, but the edges will always be a little fuzzy.
Yeah, just speaking of the edges, I was thinking of a conversation with Ben where he was talking about trying to figure out where a poem starts and ends. That might help us a little bit just in thinking through delineating boundaries.
Yeah, so, to pick up on a few of those different things. So, like Megan was saying, there's a poetic corpus that people just agree about. And when you're reading through Exodus and you hit the Song of the Sea, for example, you don't really need to be told, oh, Moses is singing a song here. It just jumps out at you. It's clearly different from the surrounding material. And it feels like a poem or a song. And so maybe it's helpful to ask the question of, well, how do you distinguish poetry from prose in the Bible or from Proverbs, on the other hand? And that helps to answer the question of, how do you know when a poem begins and ends? I think what really distinguishes it from prose is that prose just kind of runs on. It just keeps going and going and going and going. There's no sort of feeling that, oh, this section sort of fits together and then is related to the next little bit.
Right.
And one of the things that Patterson talks about in his book is that sort of across cultures, the poetic line seems to be roughly 3 seconds in length.
Oh, interesting.
And that seems to have to do with how our minds work. Our brains kind of parse 3 seconds as a moment. And anything longer than that, and it's getting difficult to hold it all together, which has got to do with short-term memory, I think. And it also helps to work out what we mean by a long poetic line or a short poetic line. Like long or short compared to what? Well, compared to 3 seconds. And so as we hear poems, we're trying to fit together the contents of it into a roughly sort of 3 second package. That's just what our minds will do. And we're trying to put that together. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that as we listen to poetry, we hear it as poetry because we can break it into those rough sort of 3 second chunks in a way that we don't with prose. And we do see a similarity to it in Proverbs. So Proverbs is usually sort of 2-line proverbs. What distinguishes Proverbs from poetry usually is that we can't sort of package it together. We can't package multiple lines together into a line group. They might be thematically related, or they might share common words that make sense to group them together, but they're not creating an effect together in the way that poems are.
And I think it's important to say that, like, Proverbs seems to be collected in those orders for reasons, but that still is kind of within very small chunks.
Right. Yeah, and the sequences of Proverbs often make sense. You can sort of go, oh yeah, they're all talking about roughly the same thing, or they've got words that are connecting them, but they're not kind of doing something together in quite the same way that a poem is.
So does the 3 second thing work for Hebrew poetry?
Yeah, I was trying this out with some of the poems on Ecclesiastes,
I'm so
and I think it does. I mean, obviously, it depends on the pace that you speak at, but one of the things that Patterson comments is that lines that you would typically say shorter than 3 seconds, we tend to say slower. And lines that are longer than 3 seconds, we tend to speed up through them to try and hold it to that roughly 3 second kind of rule. And I think it's actually quite helpful, or I found it quite helpful in working out where do the lines actually break in Hebrew poetry. Some of that you can work out just by how the sounds fit together. It's quite natural. But just at a cognitive kind of level, when it starts to stretch out too long, there's an increasing tension until it sort of snaps. And
when you talk about a line here in this context, are you talking about the whole line, or are you talking about how do we define a line?
What is a
so
line?
when we talk about parallelism, are we talking about the two halves being half lines, or are they each lines?
Fun with fractions.
People talk about this terminology differently, but I think generally what we would say in our English Bibles is typically a verse. Like one proverb, for example, is typically one verse, but it's broken into two lines. Mm-hmm. And so those two lines often kind of parallel each other, support each other in some way. But are interconnected into one verse.
That would be similar in the Psalms.
Mm-hmm.
Job.
Sometimes it's 3 lines for a verse. I mean, it can be a bit different, but often that's how it's broken up.
Yeah. Maybe it's worth just talking about the different ways that parallelism works. There's very straightforward. It's almost a repetition, but it's not quite a repetition, but it's very similar words or very similar ideas in the same order. What are some of the other variations?
Mm-hmm. Some would call one like almost a step parallelism, where the thoughts sort of build in sequence. So they're not necessarily saying the same thing over, but it's progressing the thought one more step. I think, Ben, you mentioned as well sort of the contrastive. You have one thought expressed and the next presents the opposite. That's probably a very familiar form, especially from things like the Proverbs, where you have the wise and the fool, the wicked, the righteous, sort of contrasted in lines. I wonder if the one Robert Loth, who came up with sort of these classic categories of parallelisms, I don't know this definitively, but I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of that work was coming from Proverbs, because you do have a very neat, you tend to have a pretty neat parallelism in a lot of those, which is not necessarily evident everywhere you go. Though parallelism is an important feature of Hebrew poetry.
But there are examples of places in the Hebrew Bible where lines aren't related to each other in parallelism, but there's also something called enjambment, which is actually what a lot of Lamentations 1 through 4 is. You get a change in 5 where it's parallelism. But enjambment is where the two lines can't actually grammatically stand alone. So in parallelism, you have 2 lines that are sentences, for lack of a better word, where grammatically it's one full, complete thought and another full, complete thought.
So let me just...
Yes, give an example. Great.
I'm open at Psalm 81, just randomly, sing for joy to God our strength, shout in triumph to the God of Jacob.
Yeah,
so
exactly. So sing and shout,
on their own.
And they stand on their own.
Yep.
But whereas enjambment is where, as an example in Lamentations 2, you get the verb and a prepositional phrase in the first line, and then you get the subject and the object in the second line. So, he cast down from heaven to earth the Lord, daughter Zion. And so you get this kind of, the second line can't actually stand on its own. It's just the Lord, daughter Zion. That's not a thought, and not a complete thought. So you also get lines relating to each other in different ways from parallelism, even though that's, kind of less common in biblical poetry.
So why is that a poem then?
Why is it still a poem? It's still poetic because it shares all of the other kind of key characteristics that you would think of. These things like imagery and the way that it has kind of this density of words, and the way that it kind of intensifies and has emotional and visceral language. All of those sorts of things still kind of characterize it, and it still has this lineation that you get in the rest of biblical Hebrew poetry. But that's one of the little pushbacks on parallelism as defining feature versus characteristic. It's a characteristic that's in most of biblical Hebrew poetry. Sure. However, as defining feature, then you have these poems, and you're like, well, they're pretty obviously poems. We all feel they're poems. They fit. even though they have these different features, these different aspects.
I think it's also worth mentioning, since you're talking Lamentations, you often have things going on a larger structural level as well that help tip you off. So in the case of Lamentations, acrostics.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very clearly, Megan's done a lot more, so I'll let her speak to that. But that also, very quickly, that's maybe one of the places where Hebrew poetry can also be visual poetry sometimes too, because you may hear that, but also it's really striking when you look down at it to see the same letter either in chunks, like you have in Psalm 119, Aleph, 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 for 8 lines. Okay, next letter. Or you have subsequent letters of the alphabet, one after the other. So that would be another way of creating this sense of order and completeness, complete unit that's beyond just the level of the line, but actually for the unit altogether. As I say, Megan's done a lot more with the acrostics, but
Do you want to tell us more about the acrostics?
Well, I guess going back to talking about limericks way back at the beginning, that's a form that we're familiar with in English poetry. It's kind of a set expectation of how many lines you have and how those are structured together. So one of the different forms that Hebrew poetry has is alphabetic acrostics. And so this is where the letters of the Hebrew alphabet are kind of successively at the beginning of either a line or some manner of unit of poetry. It can be different in different poems. And so as you kind of continue throughout the poem, you're anticipating the next letter. It's Aleph, Beit, Gimel, or English, it would be A, B, C. And so you have that kind of building expectation as it kind of guides you towards the end when you get to the final letter of the alphabet. And so Lamentations 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all set in kind of varying ways of doing the alphabetic acrostic, but they're all alphabetic acrostics. And Psalm 119 is the obvious example. A lot of people look to that one, but also even Proverbs 31, the wife of noble character, woman of noble character, however people put that, is also one of those poems that has a kind of sense of, you very much know the beginning and end of that delimitation because it's the whole alphabet.
Lamentations also raises the question of the form of the poem, doesn't it? Because there's Lamentations, these are laments. Are they all keynote? I mean, and what constitutes a?
Oh, great!
What constitutes a keynote, a lament within Hebrew poetry?
Well, I mean, it's again one of those questions that doesn't have the most clear answer. So genres and forms in the Hebrew Bible in general, within poetry, they're all kind of. I mean, genre is very fluid in some ways. That again, we can see the center kind of easily, but then there's lots of things that kind of interact and draw from multiple things and do parodies and all of that. So I won't have the most straightforward answer, but typically with Lamentations, you think of each of the chapters as being slightly different in genre or form, or however we're parsing those two terms. So when you get to Lamentations 5, it's quite clearly a communal lament, and it very much could sit among the Psalms in many ways. Other than that, it doesn't have a happy ending, which many communal laments in the Psalter do. But 1, 2, and 4, people sometimes say it's a dirge, so saying that someone's died. Sometimes you talk about the kind of kina rhythm, which is kind of, people say it's almost limping, which I don't love because it almost sounds negative, like it sounds like a negative characterization, but it does have this almost uneven sort of rhythm where you have a longer and then shorter line, often paired next to each other. So you're kind of moving forward in that way. Some people talk about it being like city laments in the broader ancient Near Eastern culture. And then, of course, Lamentations 3 is different from all of those. It has forms of individual lament from the Psalms and forms of communal lament. So it is kind of tricky to parse these things out very specifically, because they kind of draw from different forms and different genres within the Hebrew Bible.
And do we need to parse them out? Do we need, what is it, the way, do we want to try to characterize these things in this way? Does it, to what extent does it matter?
Depends you ask.
Well, it certainly does matter some, because when you're trying to categorize things, that's part of understanding them and making sense of them. So even if they defy your categorization, trying to relate them to other things is actually really helpful for understanding what they're doing. And so there is this sense in which, even if someone's going to look at Lamentations 1 and say, well, it's actually dirge and kina and city lament and, whatever else, well, that's actually, weirdly enough, still defining it and characterizing it, because you're characterizing it in relation to all these other things. It has these elements, and that helps understand what it's doing. Even if it's tricky, I think it tends to be a worthwhile question, and maybe you're interested in pushing back, but I think there is a very helpful feature in characterizing and categorizing, even though it's so challenging to do.
Yeah, I think that's the question of what is it doing is a really helpful one. And I think that is why we're trying to distinguish poems from prose on the one hand, or proverbs on the other, or understanding how different types of poems relate to each other, and how they're distinguished from each other, because they're doing something. They're doing something different from what different things are doing. And as we read scripture, we want to be asking, what is God doing to me? What does he intend to do to me through this particular form and this content?
And I think generally, maybe lots of Bible readers just sort of grew up in the church assuming that it's all the content, that you just sort of need to extract these true doctrines and true principles from the scriptures. Is the Bible true? Yes and amen. I would also say that the scriptures do something through their form. And so actually the ways in which God has communicated through these human authors in different contexts across many thousands of years, that matters too. And I always want people to know the Bible isn't just true, which it is. It's also brilliant and it's beautiful. Like, this is exquisite. And it's something to taste like honey, and to savor. And I think that's one of the areas where poetry is just so captivating. I just find my eyes lighting up over and over when I know I'm only catching a small fraction of its wit and its artistry, but whenever I do catch a glimmer, I'm like, oh, that is fun. And that's really, really beautiful. And it's more memorable. Ben's mentioned this before too, that poetry is often memorable in a way that prose isn't. And Megan was talking before also about emotion. So, I mean, Job is quite striking. You have 2 chapters of prose in the beginning, and then all of a sudden, I call it the verbal floodgates opening. And there's just this torrent of verbiage from Job and his friends. And it's very quickly this interior view. For Job and his friends, poetry is spoken, right, in characters' voices. It's not from the narrator. It's a very voiced thing. And so that often kind of drives you to the interior as well, which is, I think, why we often find it so sort of emotionally resonant. So I would just add that to what you guys have already been hopefully articulating.
It is striking that the Lord has given us so much poetry, isn't it?
Yeah. About a third, people typically say, of the Hebrew Bible is poetry. Yeah.
And it's funny, just talking about why is biblical Hebrew poetry in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament? I think that gets to the wider question of, like, why do we have the Old Testament, and what is the whole corpus, the whole book doing? Because I always get slightly uncomfortable when people talk about the Bible as like an instruction manual. There are definitely aspects that could make it similar to that, but it's not just how to live. I think there's so much more about just shaping and forming a people, that there's something about actually engaging in the text that's supposed to shape you, inform you, and do something to you just by reading it and meditating on it and
arguing about it.
Yeah, arguing about it and discussing it and being in community, speaking God's word together. Like there's so many different kind of aspects that can't kind of be boiled down propositionally. Yeah, and you talk about kind of having Job in you in a way of like, it's meant to actually do something to me as a text that is living and active in the Word of God, that it does shape people.
Yeah.
I think that's a brilliant point on which to close this conversation. It's been a really fascinating discussion, as I knew it was going to be with you three. That's been very entertaining. It's just worth emphasizing, of course, that most of us are not reading in Hebrew, and we can get so much out of this even without learning Hebrew. I mean, go and learn Hebrew. It gets better. The poetry is the hard stuff. My Hebrew is not great, and I get into the poetry and I think, I thought I was doing all right, and now it's hard. So, yeah, I'm glad I can still doing it. Still read this in English. It does work in translation. You don't get some of the nuances, some of the cleverness. But the Lord has enabled us to understand his word through translation as well. So, do go away and read some of the Bible's poems, meditate on them, reflect on what God is doing to you through the form as well as through the words. Let's not just pull these things to bits and try to turn them into a set of propositions, but let's let the Bible's poetry seep into us and transform us. So thank you very much for joining us. Please do rate and review this podcast. Subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast from. Tell your friends particularly about this conversation, and about all the others as well. There's so much more good stuff to come on the Tyndale House podcast. So thanks for joining us. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Tony.